Should we close the door or just wait for a few minutes? Do we get most of the people here? How I can start?
Okay.
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Willow Wei Lanhai, Director of China Institute Gallery. Welcome all of you to this special lecture. And it is truly my pleasure to welcome New York artist Ross Lewis to introduce and discuss his newest work, Rope Paintings, first time in the public. So it is really our privilege to have this lecture. Now someone asked me early, why Ross? This is China Institute. Why I invite a foreign artist to give this lecture? Of course, not only because Ross got his education in America, because he's the one suggesting me not reading bio, so pardon me, I'm not going to read his bio. Everyone has his bio on the chair. And it's not also because he speaks Chinese. And it is also not because he's a member of China Institute for a long time. He was a teacher, he was a lecturer, he was a young associate member, associated with China Institute for so long. Here I'm going to tell you the story why, the reason we invite Ross here. It is really linked with Dunhuang, that magic place. Last year is the year of Dunhuang for China Institute Gallery. And when in a conversation I talked to Ross about the second part of the year of Dunhuang is the exhibition called Inspired by Dunhuang. He gets so excited. He said, I was there. I have a lot of work inspired by Dunhuang. I said, too bad at that time the checklist is finalized and I must have some limitation. It's only for Chinese artists, right, Ross? So that's why I brought up this foreign artist term to mention Ross's work. However, it is really my pleasure to include his work in our catalog. So you can look at the current exhibition's catalog. It does showcase very prominent in one page of Ross's work. So this exhibition of Dunhuang really is the reason to bring Ross here. Now this exhibition, what do we want to say to the public? To me, there are two major points. One is what's the relationship of tradition and the contemporary. Now from the work downstairs, people can see the tradition really is just like a rich pool to inspire the artist. Doesn't matter Chinese or foreigners. Then the second point of this exhibition really try to touch the very fundamental point is where these artists get their inspiration. This is a very fundamental point. So I hope tonight Ross is going to give us this very special lecture to introduce and show his newest work, and all of us can be inspired by his work. And I believe somewhere he will mention Dunhuang. And also I'd like to mention in his early tour to Dunhuang, he took a few travelers. And I'm so fortunate to have a few travelers who went to Dunhuang tonight are also here. So I thank you all for your respect and the enjoyment of Dunhuang. Let's welcome Ross.
Thank you so much, Willow. Well, this place holds a very special place in my history. As Willow has said, I've taught here. I've grown up here. Some of my fellow travelers we roughed it in the desert. But tonight's a little bit of a departure because this is all about a Western artist who's has looked east, and I've studied the East. I've studied China with a kind of intensity that I think is kind of unique, and I believe that you'll get a feel for that tonight. But I wanted to start to say that my earliest chance to know anything about Chinese culture was at the Hunan balcony on Broadway. My mom and I went and we had Chinese food there. And I loved getting the food in those silly like dishes where you lifted the lid off. So anyway, I just wanted to say that was my first appreciation of pseudo-Chinese culture. Let me backtrack. I just want to thank you, Willow, and thank you, Eva, and thank you, Tom, for all having me here tonight. And the other thing I wanted to just say is this place has been going since 1926. And I hope it continues. I think there's a huge history here that's very special and unique. And so I'm delighted to be a part of it. Now back to the Hunan balcony. So after the Hunan balcony, I went to school at Columbia Grammar. I wanted to take French. French was all full. My history teacher was taking Chinese up at Columbia at night courses. So I ended up studying Chinese with him. And then a Mrs. Picciarelli. Mrs. Picciarelli started to teach us Chinese. Then I studied one summer with a lady in Florida where I was visiting my grandparents. And she ran a Chinese restaurant. She started to teach me Chinese calligraphy and how to speak. And then sort of the light bulb kind of started to go off really when I got to college and I went to Oberlin. And at Oberlin I had the most fantastic opportunity to study Chinese calligraphy and painting with a lady named Daphne Rosenzweig. And Daphne is an art historian and also an appraiser. And she would show us calligraphy and have us really do study work from the calligraphy. And then I went to the Traces of the Brush exhibit. So now we're going to start with the show. For several years I was at the Met doing demonstrations as I was doing here and teaching kids all about calligraphy. And this is me signing my painting of the character Long. Ru Xia Shu. Ru Xia or Ross writes or signs. Nothing more joyful than a bunch of happy kids. And I remember calling my friend Susan and saying to her, Susan, guess what? There's a young generation. They really like calligraphy. So I was so excited. So Traces of the Brush, which I just spoke about, was a landmark exhibition at Yale. It was a symposium that was run to introduce basically the great masterworks of calligraphy to the Western audience. And what was so amazing is I was a student and I knew more than some of the art historians. And I'm not boastful, but I had studied the use of the brush, so I knew what the brush did. So when they started to look at a Mi Fei, they didn't understand exactly how the brush really worked. So they had these impressions that it was really fast. Well, actually, even though Mi Fei says something about spontaneity and speed, I find that a lot of calligraphers work quite slowly. Anyway, one of the things that you'll see that I've taken from my own work is the sense of dynamism, the sense of space, the sense of dry, and this kind of wonderful way that characters create language, both pictorial and also literary. And here's Zhang Yu. I always look at these two characters. Both the moon, and I love the way he recreates the moon in so many ways. So I, as an artist, can have license to create in more than one way. My moon doesn't have to be one moon. Bada Shanran has been important to me because of his space, because of the dance-like quality of his line, because of the sort of whimsy, and also he kind of, in a very political time, he kind of said things kind of light, in a way that seemed kind of lighthearted. So the first step of learning was to study with some of the masters in Taiwan and in New York. This is one of the quotes that I love. Chinese painters thought that somehow the painting was supposed to create a moral environment for them to think and view, and for the viewer to think. And so the early painters, that's early painter, studying here in New York. Guo Xi, one of my favorite all-time painters. What is it that I love about him? He's kind of, his space, his sense of that open air, the craggly trees. And in fact, one of the things that he said that I kind of loved was that, oh well, we're going to have to pass on what he said, but basically, I think Guo Xi saw that he was trying to bring a moral world to the viewer. Here's a copy I did. So I was trying to understand the space, the line. This is my teacher Li Hong in Taipei. And Li Laoshi was really the first one to take me into the essence of Chinese painting. And that's a drawing I did of him on the left, and he signed it for me. And here's a study painting. This is his work and my study from it. Now, one of the problems with studying Chinese painting is that you sometimes get really bogged down on trying to look like the master. Well, if you really understand the essence of Chinese painting, which I think Li and also C.C. Wang, who taught me in New York, they gave me that the real part of it is not that you're a slave, but that you enter the shoes of that painter, but then you have to come out with your own stuff. But it took me quite a while to get there. Actually, this is a Dong Chi Chang copying a Nizan, and then a Ross Lewis from a C.C. Wang painting in C.C.'s collection. And above is a colophon by Liu Yanxiao. I took this to China. Liu is one of the great painters of the 20th century, and he wrote that my piece had the verisimilitude of the real, that it felt like the real. And then C.C. was nice enough to sign it also. I also loved, I felt always I should have studied longer with C.C., but the things I did get from him were that he said I should look at texture and look at Wang Meng and Gong Xian. So this is a Gong Xian on the left, and then on the right, I cut the paper to the wrong size. So C.C. came over and said, no problem, let's just extend it. So he helped me extend it up on the right. So some of the other artists that I got to visit with over the time, Zhang Daqian in Taiwan. Turns out the family I was living with, the architect of his building was the father of the family I lived with in Taiwan. Zhu Jizan, who lived to 104. So I said to him, you were with the Fauves in Paris. Tell me how to blend East and West. Give me your secrets. He said, there are no secrets. You've got to go on your own journey. But I did take from him that sense of freedom, that you could do what you wanted. And Li Keran, I took an album with me in China, and one of the things about the album that was cool is you could have a dialogue with an artist. You'd say, hey, would you paint a little something in my album? And so that's, Li Keran did one, and then Liu Laoshi also did some for me. So I learned from all these guys. So formally and informally, I've taken in the Chinese line and culture. And there's Wang Laoshi and Zhang Shoucheng, also a painter that I work with. I was a director of a place called Hammerquist Gallery for years, where we showed contemporary Chinese painting. And I invited CC to do a performance piece. This is Chou Shu, who I'm going to be showing my work with in Shanghai. And so I look to the old guys and the young guys. So what's my line? I looked at the Chinese artists, but then I looked at the Western artists. And so I thought I had an affinity for the abstract expressionists like Franz Klein. I started with canvas. But then you realize that Franz Klein wasn't really making calligraphy. He was using a Bell optic projector. So he was projecting things that were realistic, and then they became so enlarged that they started to have a sense of abstraction. So his interest wasn't really calligraphic line whatsoever. But what he did have, which I've taken away, is the emotionality, the sense of trying to connect with the universe through your line. And this is Clifford Still, another of my favorites, and early Lewis, and Motherwell, who looks very Asian, but I don't think it has the depth, but it has the design. And this is a piece I did. So On the Move. I started to try to come up with my own characters. So I looked to dance. I used to go to Merce Cunningham's studio, and I would draw at rehearsals. I even did a performance piece at Dia with a musician and with a dancer. And then I tried playing around with ink tone and layering. And then as a way to have my pieces actually moved, I had a scroll machine, which I created. Be very useful for Torahs also. But here you can see Merce and I actually had a conversation about line. He said, you know, when your work becomes too much looking like dance, I don't like it so much. And he in fact pushed me a little bit. He wasn't a formal teacher, but I was there in rehearsal watching, and I would go up to him and I'd say, Merce, what do you think? And he would give me a little bit of his feedback. Here's your home version of the scroll machine. My sort of culminating work with the dance calligraphy in the subway. A piece going to metal with the calligraphy idea. So here the wall became the paper, the metal figures became my characters. Central Park, I used fabric. And then here in China, I was exhibiting in 2005, and they said, 做一看是汉字，再一看天知道是什么字. So it says, when you first look, you think it looks like Chinese characters, but when you look again, what in the hell is it? What kind of character is it? So then I tried to meld East and West, and using acrylic and hemp paper. And I did a Kaiha series, means open join. So I was trying to open to all the elements and join them together. It was from a Chinese philosopher who I was reading at the time. And finally, I came to tape, which was where I think my break came, which is leading to the rope. I started to say, you know, the brush might not be the medium for me, the tool. Let me try tape. And the tape is kind of the negative of the brush line. And interestingly enough, I started with color first. And I wanted the pieces to suspend in space. They were based on the Song fan. They were round, but the Song fan had been 8 inches, and I made these 5 feet in diameter. So I started my composition with a tape line on a piece of hemp paper onto a plastic. Then I painted over it. Then I flipped the back and painted from the back. Then I peeled it off the wall, sort of like the way I studied Chinese scroll mounting at the Palace Museum. And then I got this, with the tape coming off, and then my final composition. And what I liked about this was that the line had a somewhat of a structure, but it also had a randomness because the paint seeped through in varieties of ways. So the surface always was a surprise to me. So I liked that kind of balance. And I think the Chinese painters also subscribe to that sense of order and randomness. So then I went to black and white. Here this is actually ink, and I used the tape line again. Moved to acrylic. These were smaller. I started to vary the line so I could rip the tape in different thicknesses to start to think about the movement of the line, sort of way the brush did. I also was doing lines in public spaces. So here I did a piece at Rutgers with a net, and it was called Hidden Meanings, and I used black light, and you would see under the black light these hidden brush strokes on the wall. And I also was using a mop to draw with at that time. So I'd already started to experiment away from the tape, but I was still sort of tied to that brush. And I also used copper tubing, you see, for line. There's the black light. I did a piece which is the Dunhuang homage, I guess. This is, I chiseled the line in the wall. And this is the piece that's in the catalog here. And the swing, the idea was that you would swing through the space and be part of a three-dimensional painting. And I painted the windows, the walls, the floors, to create a total environment, all with brush, but no ink. And then this I threw in because I really think in one of my recent public works, even though it's tile, that play of the black line in the space is still there, that comes from the Chinese painting. And that boat that suspends actually has brush lines on it. This is about 80 feet long by 24 feet high. So the next step, for about 2 years, I was working on drawings, trying to bring in all the elements that I've been thinking about. I used to sit on the sofa with my grandfather when I was little, and he would have me draw from the newspaper. And one of the things that I went back to as source material was the newspaper. And I started to cut up all sorts of random images, and I'd take them to the studio, and every day I would do a different drawing. And so for 2 years I did a drawing 30 by 40, but I used brush and ink and water-soluble crayon. But I think somewhere during this period, I actually dipped a piece of rope into ink, and I was able to start to find my way. The perspective that I looked and loved in the Chinese paintings, I think, started to come out here, like in the bottom half of this drawing, where I tilted the plane up. But you feel the distance, and you feel something in the foreground. Using the character Yong, or forever. But we know things aren't forever. Or do we? This piece I've come back to because there's something very reductive and Asian about it. There's something about the line, this dryness, that reminds me of the Nissan landscapes. It reminds me of a kind of a purity. And the space, though, I think is mine. So one of the places that I reside is my studio, mostly on a day-to-day basis. Over the door it says Mo Tian Shi, which means skyscraper studio. And that was written to me by Cheng Shifa, one of the great Chinese painters. And on the wall is a sort of intermediary piece. It says Hu Dia. I was thinking of M. Butterfly, and I was still using ink and color. My books, I divide them east and west, and in the middle is installation. as I've been working, I started to realize with the rope, some of the influences in the back of my brain came from my books, and one was by Fry Otto, who created all sorts of tensile structures. And so this was something that was there. And also the artist Fred Sandbach, who I really admire, who used string in space, kind of like the way I do now on paper. And this is the studio. So you can see arrayed on the table with all my stuff. I use bottles of ink. I use Yes glue to use for my collage because it's, even though it's something you could buy at Michael's, it's UV rated and it's perfectly fine. I buy endless amount of papers which I use for collage. They've become my color. So I can call at any moment when I think of a color or an image, I can pull out some of the paper. My bags of newspaper, which still are there, but I don't cut up the things in advance. I just go with the flow. My table, Cho gave me that spirit rock in the middle of the table. There's my ink and some of the stuff I use. My favorite broken chair. And then this is sort of the essence of my work. I believe this saying about being committed to the moment always kind of has stayed with me. And I think more and more with my rope painting, I'm feeling that sense that if you allow yourself over to the moment, that the work will somehow arrive. And it always feels magic when you actually do that. Elizabeth came to write an article and she visited me at my studio. And I thought she really understood my work very well. This was the very first piece I did. And I called up Rachel, who's on the front row, and I said, Rachel, I just had like this magic experience. I think a butterfly appeared on my paper and this sense of travel. And so here the rope was kind of very, it looks kind of like rope. But it started to play with the collage. Then I kind of reduced to one line, sort of like Fred Sandbach in space. And then this piece came about simply this. I couldn't do any more, that's why I called it simply this. But this piece felt like it had the essence of all of life in it for me at that time. I started to look at books on cosmology and Hubble photographs. A friend of mine, Michael Benson, had been photographing, taking Hubble photos and redoing them. And so I started to think about space and line, literally space. Idol, I was thinking about the id, about the false god, and about the inner self and the psyche, not unlike the abstract expressionists, who were also very engaged in that kind of thinking. I always loved Giacometti. His sense of space is so special, and so that's why I titled this piece after Giacometti. This piece, Flatline, for me, the upper part is like the end and the bottom is life. Sometimes my pieces just take a life of their own. So here I started on a piece of paper, and lo and behold, I had a bunch of lines, and they seemed so organic. And all of a sudden, it was like I had a garden on my paper. And so I just thought it would be fun to see kind of how the studio looked. And then all of a sudden, I did another piece right after, where the line became taut, and all of a sudden reminded me of a mountain and a precipice. And so then here's back to the Chinese landscape, trying to reinvent the thing that I really have been so fond of all along. This is based on this painting by Xu Daoning, but my piece is way bigger, and this is only one little section. That's a detail. So I'm using collage. I looked at Lan Ying. think that's me there in the garden. Love this piece. I thought I had seen the lights in a cathedral when I did this, that I saw the colorful light coming through a rose window. And yet when I see the line, such like a barbed wire, I wonder what it really means. I wonder if there's another emotionality that was coming over me in the line that wasn't being expressed in the color. So this is sort of a typical week where there were like 4 pieces up. Manifestation was one of the early works. These are all 8 foot. Peony. I called it peony because the collage on the left was originally peony color, but it faded and it changed color, but which is all right. But I love the quality of the rope line here. And for me, the rope line has an expressive quality that I can't quite achieve with the brush. I think there's a grittiness to it. I think there's a rawness. I also think that rope is a utilitarian kind of material, whereas the brush was designed for its purpose. I think I'm taking the rope and using it in a way that's my own, but it also functions to wrap a package or as a lasso or to hang someone. So with it is invested an expression and a meaning that's sort of real to me, and I think that's why the rope has become so important. The brush is a beautiful tool, but it was made for everybody in a way that you're supposed to, it was designed to make lines, but I'm using the rope really to make my line and not everybody else's line. This is Soul Jar. I was thinking of Shang Dynasty rope jars with myself in one as a 12-year-old. That's a detail. So I think it's kind of probably mysterious to you all at this point is how I'm making the lines. Bada was also one of the artists that I looked at a lot. And this is from an album leaf of Bada's, but everyone says that my rocks look like dogs. And it was supposed to be fish and rocks, but I guess mine's dog and whale or something. So then I started to add more layers of collage. And you can see in this that there's a lot of different things going on in each piece. One of the important aspects for painting for me is that you don't have a one-liner, that you come back to a piece, that you discover different aspects of the painting over time. So I'm not somebody who's gonna like say, this is the story the first time out. I want you to come back. I'm not gonna give you all the answers either. I'm maybe gonna give you questions. So when I work, it's really in the moment. However, it's sort of like the way I prepared for this lecture. I have a stack of information here and I haven't pulled any of it out, but it's all within me. So I've culled all those thoughts and images from days and years of thinking, and then I come to the paper, and the paper and the ink and the collage kind of answer for me. So you'll notice there's different kinds of things that I've dipped into the ink. The lines are very different. I can get something that's very subtle or very bold and bombastic. I can put one little dot exactly where I want it, or or I can make a big long line. So I think control now is something I've developed over the several years working with this medium. So this is the result. I've been working in the scroll format now for a year or two because I wanted something other than a rectangle. I realized the rectangle wasn't really my desired shape. It was really a shape more like a scientist has to have limits. So I gave myself the limitations. But as soon as I started with the scroll, I realized it gave me that sense of moving and continuity, that my storyline continues, so that there's more. And as I talk a lot, so I figured through my paintings I ought to be talking too. The rips on the side are very critical to me. All of a sudden I realized one of the things that I wasn't satisfied with the Chinese painting was it was always in this kind of nice clean edge. And I need sculpture, I need space. I've always done public art where I dealt with space, walls, and floors, and I had to find a way to bring it into the painting. And it gives an emotional charge, and it's kind of a dynamic relationship to the objects in the middle. This is actually one of my favorite pieces. It seems to it gives me everything. I can feel like the tumult of war and emotion, and architectural space, and then it's all kind of gone at the bottom into some other abstraction. That's a detail. Enula. You notice I title my paintings in foreign languages. Well, I grew up with opera, so occasionally I throw in a little Italian. Sometimes it's German, sometimes it's Chinese. This was really, I believe, the first of the scroll series. And I like the sort of wandering, almost the doodle-like quality. Now you have to understand I have an advantage over a Chinese painter. If you're working on shrink paper, if you saturate it too long, it's going to rip. I'm using a watercolor paper, so the watercolor paper is heavier. So I'm able to collage on it. So my pieces have started to get more and more sculptural. The bottom roll has started to become its own element more and more. Back to the old Chinese landscape. I tried to throw this painting out so many times. And then I said, okay, just finish it. And sure enough, I'm actually quite proud of this piece. I feel as if I could talk to Tang Yin and say, hey, look, I liked what you did back then, but look what I could do. And so we're actually friends. I'm just shaking hands with you back in time. But I think I was more inventive in some ways, even if he was a better calligrapher. So here I started to vary the ink tone. This is one of the last pieces I've been working on. I had just come back from Shanghai, and I think I felt the energy of the city. And in fact, somewhere up there is the character Shang for Shanghai in it. So I thank you for your time, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. Like Tristan and Isolde. I was listening to Tristan und Isolde.
I know the opera.
Well, that's the music I was listening to when I was painting the painting.
Oh, okay.
You know, sometimes artists don't give away all their trade secrets, but since I'm with friends, I can give you a few of them. But I think what happened is the music from Tristan kind of charged the moment for me. Typically, I turn music off because I find that I'm starting to use the rhythm of the composer instead of my own inner rhythm. So if it's a Mozart, I can't do it. If it's an Etta James, I can, because she kind of digs deep. Or if there's Electra or Tristan, the wash of emotionality from that music kind of hits me. And so then it plays a part. But ultimately, when I finish pieces, I turn the sound off, because I got to, you know, they say in China that calligraphy is like music without sound. And I'm taking it a little differently, but I want you have to have your own inner voice, and if you're starting to listen to every other sound around you, you can't find that line in that space. So, you're welcome. Yes?
Ross, well, a couple of years ago, we went out to see a space at 22nd Street in the river. You had some pieces there. It's the pre-Rope period, and it looked like, to me, those big rounded squares. Were they down there hanging? Remember?
It's possible.
Possible. It's like very.
Oh, the Shanza series, yeah.
About 5 by 5, but they look like squares, but the edges are rounded.
Yeah, I was showing that at Walter Wickheiser Gallery down in Chelsea.
So that was there. Okay.
I have a question for the audience. Since most of you know me so well, so what do you think in terms of the distillation of East and West? Do you feel the essence of the two cultures blending, or do you think it's more just Ross?
Well, I certainly feel that there's a definite blending. I mean, you can see it from the first slides that you brought in and showed the old masters and the line that they used that was so evocative. You took it, but you brought it completely into a different realm, a different rhythm that we have here in America. That's not the rhythm that's in China. And so what you did is you took the line with its meaning and you transformed it and brought it into the American emotion. So there is a wonderful combination of both.
Thanks. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious, with your recent rope paintings, they felt to me very American. They didn't feel there was that heavy influence of Chinese, but you could see it. And I'm wondering why you would occasionally go back and feel the need to do something that was so traditionally sort of a Chinese painting, landscape painting.
You know, that's the question I'm going to battle the rest of my life. But I can tell you, I've been giving it really serious thought. And I think what it is, it's probably Cece's fault. Wang Laoshi, he was so adept at creating compositions with rocks. And like it was his natural voice, and it kind of spilled out onto the paper. I think that maybe there was a sense of wanting to be close to people in that tradition, but I think even further, it's, and I'm saying that in a respectful way, but I'm also saying the other aspect, I really truly think that those landscapes, they allow me to live and breathe, that I can't always reside in the here and now in the US. And I think maybe they're a bit escapist, but I also feel such a kinship. It feels like I'm not really just painting. I think it's something about the texture. I think it's something about the majesty of the mountains. and the place where humans are really subverted. And in this society, we're always thinking we're so big, we're so in focus. And all of a sudden I look at those landscapes and I kind of find my place in nature. And I also, it allows me to leave Long Island City and travel. So I think it serves a lot of different things. But for the moment, I don't feel the compulsion to do a Chinese landscape. It just happens. It's like, just like I look at the newspaper and I see images, all of a sudden I'll see an image in the studio. I'll pull out a book if I'm reading a book on Song painters or literati artists, and I'll say, huh, this looks cool. And then all of a sudden I'm on a journey that I never expected. But yeah, I'm fighting it. I fight it. And years ago, someone said to me, how as a Westerner can you possibly do Chinese painting? Because isn't that kind of fake? And I said, but I feel it. It's in me. And it's true. And I was asked just before on camera about the difference between appropriation and was I an appropriationist? And I don't think so. I think appropriation is someone who comes to an art form after they've formed their ideas and they're appropriating to express their ideas. I think that I grew up with the brush and line inherently as part of my inner artistic self. It's been going on since high school. Whether I studied in China or not, whether I got more in depth later on, I think it was always there. So.
Follow-up question? I mean, I should know these answers, but how would you use a brush? When was the last time you picked up a brush and incorporated that into your artwork?
When somebody wants me to do a calligraphy demonstration or a landscape, I don't. I have all these beautiful brushes that I got at Rongbao Jai and all these wonderful stores in China, and I don't know what to do with them at the moment. But I do. I pick up rope. Yes.
Ross, I've known you for a long time, and since I'm an artist myself, and since I'm the daughter of an artist, maybe I can shed a little bit of light. One is that my father, C.C. Wong, have come to the conclusion in his later years, because he also had that question, how can I become Western, even though he's a Chinese artist? What is in the Western art that is so beautiful that perhaps the Chinese artists haven't digested or haven't gotten in touch with? And he did the opposite of what you did. You went to China in Chinese painting to get that Chinese sensibility. He tried to look at the Western and get the Western sensibility. So you pick up the brush from time to time. And what I see in your painting is that you really have tried to digest the sensibility of both cultures. And it's within you, it's inside of you. So when you touch deeply into your own soul, and when you release yourself from thinking whether you're a Western artist or a Chinese artist, or whether you're doing Western painting or Chinese painting, it doesn't matter. Whatever, when you touch yourself very deeply, you express yourself from the bottom of your heart and the bottom of your soul, it comes out naturally because you have digested to a certain degree. Now my father, instead of using the brush, he occasionally would use a house painting brush, those flat brush to do his calligraphy.
I did that too. I tried all the tricks of the trade. But I think the essence is what you're saying, is that it's going to come together, and whatever tool ultimately you use, it's going to have all of you. However, I have to say the rope feels more like me. I go into the studio and I think, gosh, I'll pick up a brush, and but then I'm going to make their work. And when I pick up the rope, it's like me. And it might change, but at the moment, because occasionally I throw in some feathers or a sponge. You know, when you think about it, there are Chinese painters like Liu Guosong, or people who crumple their paper and make their lines and their sense of composition and texture through all different approaches. They use bullet holes on paper. They run tractors over them with paint. But for me, I would have loved for CC to have seen this, because when he saw the tape line, he said, it doesn't sing enough. You know, but I think nothing I would have done would have quite lived up to what he wanted. But I think the rope he might have started.
You would love your rope paintings.
Anyway, I think I learned along the way. And as I said earlier, I think the rope has so much baggage in it as itself, and texture and variety, that it kind of, like the newspaper, it kind of feeds me and charges me. But yeah, it would have been fun at this time, because if he was still here, to have a dialogue and to show him the Chinese, so-called Chinese paintings. Because I don't think they're Chinese paintings. It happens that I'm looking at back, but they're still me looking back, just the way your dad would have looked at Western art. But I think it's within the provenance of every artist to look around. You know, it's our job.
Well, if I may conclude this, I think it's not a rope. The rope is just an instrument that you use. It's your own sensitivity that you have put into the rope, which makes your rope painting. Some of them are just fabulous. And I think he would have so much fun with you. He will cut with his paper, you'll put your ropes on, you'll have fun together.
Yes.
Just wondering, I'm curious, given the abstraction, do you start by blank piece of paper, or how does it, or do you have the thought in your mind, or does it work its way out as that you progress?
Well, that's a really, actually great question, because I learned in college. We had a class where they gave the students, art students, two options. You could be in a group starting with a blank piece of paper, or you could be in the group where they already had made a mark on the paper. So I learned something about myself, well, I thought, because I tended to like it when it had the mark already there. Sort of like the way the public space activated my mind, so that I see a crack in the ground and all of a sudden I imagine a piece. But when I'm doing these, I'm stuck because there's no one else doing the project with me. So I typically start with a piece of, like I'm using the scroll format, like here, and I start. I just start, and maybe I've just spent the previous hour looking at images. Maybe I've just come to the studio and I just start and put a mark on the paper. Both ways are hard, because sometimes when you come with an image in mind, you clam up, you tighten up, and you're not open to the moment and the instincts which are so natural to you. And so then I have to rip, because I go, oh nuts, that really wasn't working. Or sometimes I go, huh, that works, but that edge is not working. So now I have to rip, and then I go back and I go forth. And so then there's a combination. There's a combination of things that I've planned. Sometimes they go well, sometimes they don't, and things that are surprises. But I would say the most critical thing for me is to be in the moment. And Louise Bourgeois said something about that you can be a stupid artist when you're not focused, when you're not in the moment. That to be a smart artist, you have to really be a thinking artist. So even if you're not thinking literally, but you're kind of there, I think that's what it is, that you're in that moment. I often feel that I'm not actually doing the work, to be honest. I know that sounds mysterious art talk, but when I go into the studio and I start, I feel like I'm in a very nice prison cell. It's a good one because I'm making art, but if I break it, I lose that moment. And so I'm totally in that place. And I guess a lot of people who in different creative acts in their lives all talk about that. And I think it's for real. I really believe that. So I hope that answered the question. Do you have a question?
No, I was just gonna say that I think when you do East and West, and you have both that are very deeply felt by you, or an artist who feels both sides, that there's always going to be an inherent tension between those two parts of you, and you're gonna keep zigzagging back and forth through it. It's not, I mean, that's part of the dynamic of your energy and creativity.
But I do feel a little bit like Mondrian, which is he was a very capable 19th century artist whose work looked like a lot of other people of his time, and all of a sudden he made a leap into his sort of signature work. And I feel as if, even though I have that kind of struggle, which is my own thing, that I feel like all of a sudden I've kind of taken a big leap out of whatever I was before. Whether
I didn't mean it that way, that it wasn't yours. I'm just saying it's gonna be there, and then 5 years from now, the roles may not be here.
I know, wouldn't that be
That's
sad?
the part of the dynamic of this back and forth, is that somewhere you may find something else.
Ross, are you working vertical or horizontal?
Oh, it depends on the piece. Most of them I'm working vertically. So I had to learn how to control the drips. So sometimes I really love the drip, and other times I kind of don't work with the drip. But I did a couple pieces on the floor, and then I felt like Pollock. And I was glad to say hello to him for a few minutes, but then I had to come back to Ross. It's harder though in a way, vertically, because my pieces are 9 and 8 feet tall. So I'm up and down on a ladder. And then when I work towards the floor, I have a little foam garden, like one of those little foam pads. And I kneel. And then getting up is always a challenge these days. But yeah, that's important. And I love it because it's kind of physical. So in between thinking, I have the physicality. And so I think the dynamic is really good for me.
I just thought of something, the whole thing about mountains and landscape. When you're working with 9 feet, you're now making yourself that small figure confronting the landscape. You're creating landscape, but you've kind of done something there too, right? In terms of journeying in this, scale of the piece to your, I don't know what I'm saying, but.
No, I get the idea that you're thinking that my proportion to the large scroll.
It's just interesting how the subconscious does weave you did all that studying of mountains and landscape and scenery, and now you're.
Well, the funny part is, I think of the scrolls as small. Because of all the large-scale public art I did, working 80 feet by 24 feet, when I came to the studio and I first started on pieces like this, I felt like I was in a studio apartment, cramped in. So I slowly got to a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom with 3 baths, and then I finally got to my penthouse, which is getting closer, which is the scroll, where I feel that I can unravel and open up. But I'm sort of curious to go back to public space, large spaces, to see if I can survive in that space, or if I'm now in this space. For the moment, I'm not going anywhere. But it's interesting. I think the artist's relationship to their scale does say something about their worldview, without a doubt.
So anything without a scissor lift is small?
That's what I used to think.
I may have missed this part, but what was the inspiration for the first time that you tore into its sides? In other words, what was the inspiration for that? The actual tear?
I think the space wasn't working for me.
In what way was that?
I was limited. And I didn't, it seemed too flat and too kind of trim. And all of a sudden I needed the texture, the roughness of the edge of the paper. And it also, you know, like Elizabeth Murray's work, some people know Elizabeth Murray. So her shaped canvases, I always liked the way they worked for her, but and I've always been thinking, well, how do I take that paper, which is, I've come from these traditions, and even in the West we have landscape painting, it's in a lovely rectangle with a frame around it, and I abhorred it. It was like, it's limited by the frame, so when I came to Chinese painting, I had just the silk, which was just a way to protect it really, but you were unrolling this whole idea for the viewer, but I still felt kind of like it's still a rectangle mounted. So when I started, the rip was, I think, the first tear was a very emotional thing. I was a little scared. I thought, oh, I'm going to screw up my painting. And instead, I think I actually found the way in. So
you kind of tripped over it.
Yeah, I think like most of the things I've done. Yes.
Ross, about the rope, I just so intrigued by your use of it as a medium. This may be a really dumb question. Can you reuse it? Do you reuse it? Do you wash it? Do you chuck it? Do you use it with caked on paint?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Actually, I get really frustrated because sometimes I get attached to a piece of it. And then I go, oh nuts, it's all dry. And now what am I going to do? So then I saturate it with more ink and some water. And then I try to revive it. You know, what's funny is the little pieces of paper that I use for my collage, I have a bag of them. And that bag is like my jewels. And the ropes, even the ones, as you're saying, that caked on, they still sit on my tabletop. And I sometimes think I'm going to pick one up and reuse it. But then some days I go, you know, it's time for a fresh piece. Let's try, because this one isn't doing it. But the caked on ones get a different texture.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could those rooms be part of the future collage installation?
Oh. I don't think so. You mean to use the actual rope in ink as an installation? And the artist. I think more likely is that I want to draw right now on a wall with a huge rope and have like 20 people holding it and helping me bend it and shape it onto like a large space to see how it would go in like a lobby where it could go up and down and insinuate itself into space. That would be where I would go, but to use the actual rope, there's really great artists who are already dipping rope into oil and into this, and they make huge rope installations. So my hat's off to them, but I don't want to do that.
Do you always use hemp rope? Is it always the same size, or do you vary the rope?
Oh, I have a lot of different ropes, and some are nylon, some are cotton, some are hemp. They vary. But typically the ones that can take ink, because nylon sits on the surface. Well, I thank you all. One more.
I'm sorry, I'm just really intrigued by this rope thing. You say you try to saturate the rope again with ink and water. Does that mean you're using water-based paint?
Yeah, the ink is water soluble.
But you're not using any paint, just ink?
Just ink, and then all the color is collage. So I brought that little piece just so that you can get a feel for the surface. It doesn't have all of the intricacies and layers of my bigger works, but just so you can see, all of that color is collaged, and all of the line on there is dipped in ink. Anyway, I hope that you'll all come back for the next round You're welcome.
Nice video.
Oh,